I never thought a single day could completely unravel the life I'd painstakingly built, but that morning, March 14th, 2021, proved me spectacularly wrong. I remember waking up to the faint smell of coffee, that bittersweet aroma that usually grounded me the way it did every Saturday when the city outside New Haven was still waking up. Birds were chirping, the faint hum of traffic was in the distance, and the sunlight had just started slanting across our living room floor, cutting through the thin curtains like it was trying to make everything look calm and ordinary. But nothing was ordinary anymore. I didn't know it yet, but life as I knew it was about to implode, in the most humiliating and surreal way possible. I was 34 at the time, working as a project manager at a mid-sized software company downtown. My office life was orderly, precise, like my spreadsheets, my meetings, my carefully color-coded calendar. Outside of work, my life looked perfect, or at least what most people would call perfect. I had a house in a quiet suburban neighborhood of New Haven, a wife I had been married to for 8 years, and 2 kids under 10 who, in the morning chaos of cereal and backpacks, were blissfully unaware of the adult secrets festering around them. Our marriage, in the eyes of friends and family, was enviable. Every year, I'd be the guy who brought the roses on Valentine's Day, who remembered anniversaries down to the hour, who smiled through the mundane grind of life and made it look effortless. And honestly, I believed in it too. Or at least, I thought I did. Her name was Melissa. Melissa Turner. She had that laugh that could fill a room, the kind that made you think of warm autumn evenings, and she carried herself with this quiet confidence that sometimes irritated me, but mostly I found it magnetic. We met in college. She was studying journalism, and I was coding my way through a computer science degree thinking life was just about finding the right algorithms. She made everything feel alive, unpredictable, messy in the best way. We married in 2013, a crisp September day with golden leaves tumbling down around us at Yale University's campus. I can still remember the smell of the flowers, the soft press of her hand in mine, the way everyone seemed to smile like they knew we were meant to last forever. Looking back, I can pinpoint 1,000 little moments that should have warned me. A text left on her phone that I glimpsed once, the way she'd occasionally brush off my questions with a nervous laugh, a late night at the office that sounded increasingly suspicious, but life has a way of disguising betrayal as coincidence, and I, like a fool, chose comfort over suspicion. Maybe part of me didn't want to see it. Maybe part of me feared what I might find. The Saturday started innocuously. I had plans to take the kids to the park. Jack, my 8-year-old obsessed with skateboarding, and Emma, 6, always dragging a stuffed unicorn behind her, even to the slides. Melissa had said she was going to catch up with a friend in the city, probably some brunch at that new French cafe she'd been raving about on Instagram. I kissed her on the cheek, told her to have fun, and waved as she drove off. The house felt quiet without her, but that was normal on weekends. Around 11:30 a.m., the doorbell rang. Odd, because we hardly ever had visitors, especially on a Saturday morning. I assumed it was a delivery. I opened the door to a woman I'd never seen before. She was around my age, well-dressed, but there was a tension in her shoulders, a kind of urgency in the way she scanned the doorway, her eyes landing on me. "Are you Jason Turner?" she asked. I nodded, a little confused. "I need to speak to you about Melissa," she said, her voice low but strained. Her hand tightened on the strap of her purse. There was no mistaking it. She wasn't here to chat politely. Something inside me stiffened, though I had no idea why. I remember the air in that moment feeling thicker, almost hot. I invited her in, but I couldn't shake the instinct to keep the kids out of the living room. Jack was building a Lego spaceship in the corner. Emma was stacking blocks, completely oblivious to the storm about to crash into our tidy suburban bubble. The woman introduced herself as Rachel Matthews. She told me she was married to a man named Daniel, who I quickly pieced together was Melissa's co-worker, or at least someone Melissa had mentioned casually a few times. Rachel's voice shook as she spoke, the words tumbling out in a rush that made my heart stutter. Melissa had been seeing Daniel for over a year, and somehow Melissa had kept it secret from me. I didn't respond at first. I couldn't. My brain tried to reject it like a virus. This isn't happening. She wouldn't. Melissa wouldn't. But Rachel's eyes were steady, desperate, and horrifyingly real. She had seen it. She had proof. She had come all the way to my door because she didn't know where else to turn. I remember that moment vividly. The smell of Emma's strawberry hair bow, the faint whiff of Jack's peanut butter sandwich from earlier, the soft hum of the refrigerator. It all felt hyper-real, like my senses were suddenly on overdrive. My chest tightened, my stomach churned. Betrayal doesn't announce itself quietly. It explodes, and the first thing it does is make you question everything you ever thought was true. I wanted to scream, but the sound wouldn't come out. My mind raced, flipping through memories. All those times Melissa said she was staying late at work, the sudden trips to the city that didn't quite add up, the way she sometimes looked at her phone like she was hiding something from me. Every red flag I'd ignored now burned like wildfire. Rachel handed me a folder. Inside were texts, emails, photos, enough to confirm what I already feared. Melissa's betrayal wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate, calculated, and ongoing. I remember the feel of the paper in my hands, the way my fingers shook as I flipped through the messages. Each one felt like a hammer to my chest. I think the kids sensed something immediately. Jack looked up from his Lego spaceship, confused. Emma clutched her unicorn tighter. I wanted to shield them from it, to pretend nothing had changed, but I also knew life would never be the same. Not after this. As Rachel left, I sat on the couch, the folder open on my lap. The world outside seemed to move normally. The birds still chirped, the neighbor's dog still barked, the sun still streamed through the windows. But inside me, everything had shifted. That day, the life I thought I had was revealed as a fragile illusion, and I was left holding the shards. I remember thinking, over and over, how could I have missed it? How could someone I trusted, someone I loved with everything in me, lead a double life? The realization didn't just hurt. It shook the very foundation of who I thought I was, who I thought we were. The comfort of my suburban routine, the warmth of my Saturday morning, the laughter of my kids, it all felt tainted now, like a layer of grime over something that had once been bright and beautiful. And yet, even in that haze of betrayal, a part of me couldn't stop replaying her face. The way Melissa had smiled at me that morning, kissed me on the cheek, as if everything was normal. The thought made bile rise in my throat. How could someone compartmentalize love, family, and deceit so completely? How could the person you build your life with, the one who knows your fears, your hopes, your history, betray you so completely? I didn't know it yet, but that was the moment everything changed. That folder, those photos, those texts, they were a line in the sand. Life would not continue as before. Every laugh, every kiss, every "I love you" from Melissa would now be tinged with suspicion, with anger, with grief. I remember thinking I could never look at her the same way again. That trust, once shattered, doesn't just repair itself. It leaves scars, visible to the world, invisible to everyone else, but heavy as hell on your chest. I spent the rest of that morning in a daze, walking through our home like a ghost. The smell of coffee, the hum of the refrigerator, the sunlight, everything normal, everything mundane, felt like a cruel contrast to the chaos inside me. My kids played around me, oblivious, and I wondered how I would explain to them that their world was about to get complicated in ways they wouldn't understand for years. By the time Melissa returned home that evening, I had made a decision. I couldn't confront her yet, not without clarity, not without understanding the full extent of what had happened. But I could feel it in my bones. The life we had built together, the facade of a perfect marriage, had been irrevocably damaged. And no matter how many times she smiled, no matter how many excuses she offered, I knew one thing. Nothing would ever feel the same again. The following week felt like wading through molasses. Every moment was heavy, every interaction with Melissa coated in suspicion. I didn't know how to process the storm that Rachel had unleashed at our door. I felt like I was watching my own life through a distorted lens, one where nothing was trustworthy anymore. My mornings started with a hollow routine, getting the kids ready, making breakfast, driving them to school. But everything else existed in this strange, liminal space between disbelief and rage. Melissa acted normal. She smiled. She kissed me. She even cooked dinner like nothing had happened. But I could see it in her eyes, the subtle tightness around her mouth, the way she avoided looking directly at me. And in that small, almost imperceptible way, I began to notice the cracks she had always tried to hide. Those cracks weren't subtle anymore. They were screaming at me, loud and clear. One Thursday evening, I decided I had to confront her. I remember it was March 18th, 2021. The sky was overcast, the kind of heavy gray that makes your whole town feel smaller, suffocating. We had put the kids to bed early, claiming a quiet night. Jack was reading under the blanket with a flashlight, and Emma was asleep, clutching her unicorn like it could shield her from whatever storm was brewing downstairs. Melissa was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone. I could feel my chest tighten as I approached. Every step felt like dragging weights across the floor. I didn't know if I was going to cry, scream, or just break down completely. But I knew I couldn't go on pretending I didn't know. I asked her directly. No preamble, no soft approach. I told her I knew about Daniel, about the texts, the late nights, the deception. I remember the way her face went pale, how her grip on the phone tightened until her knuckles turned white. I thought she might have denied it at first, but instead there was this long, painful silence. It was the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, that fills the room with a weight you can almost taste. Then she confessed. Not with excuses, not with tears, just a quiet, trembling admission that left me gasping. I don't remember the exact words. It was a blur of apologies, explanations, promises that she never meant to hurt me, that it just happened, that Daniel made her feel alive in ways I hadn't. Each phrase was like a scalpel twisting deeper into me. The person I loved, the person I thought I knew completely, had willingly chosen someone else behind my back over months and months, and I was left holding the wreckage. I remember the first wave of rage. It wasn't the kind of controlled anger I sometimes feel at work or when someone cuts me off in traffic. This was pure, animalistic fury, a gnawing, clawing emotion that made my stomach churn and my hands shake. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she had caused. But instead, I just sat there, paralyzed, my mind racing with every possible scenario, every past memory now tainted by the knowledge of her betrayal. And then came the despair, the crushing, soul-sucking despair that followed the adrenaline spike. I thought about the kids, about Jack's innocent questions about love and loyalty, about Emma's soft laugh echoing in the hallway. How could I protect them from this? How could I explain to them that their mother, the woman who had read them bedtime stories, who had kissed their scraped knees, who had tucked them in and whispered, "I love you," every night, had been living a lie? I tried to make sense of it, like a puzzle with missing pieces. I replayed every dinner, every date, every moment of laughter. Were they genuine? Was any of it real? Or was it all part of a carefully constructed facade, something she had maintained while sneaking around behind my back? My mind spun endlessly, a carousel of betrayal that refused to slow down. I began noticing patterns I had previously dismissed. The way she would leave the room suddenly when her phone buzzed, the occasional late-night texts that she claimed were from work, the inexplicable moods and absences. Every single instance now screamed at me in hindsight, a relentless reminder of the truth I had been blind to. At work, I was a ghost. My colleagues noticed the change, of course, but I barely registered their concern. Every email, every meeting, every routine task felt absurdly meaningless. I found myself staring at the clock, counting down minutes until I could go home and stare at the folder Rachel had left me, as if it held the key to understanding why this had happened. Sleep was impossible. Every night, I would lie awake, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant rumble of city traffic. I'd replay every moment, every conversation, every touch, analyzing them with a precision that bordered on obsession. I even started writing notes, little observations about Melissa's behavior, times and dates, any clue that could help me understand the why. But the more I wrote, the more the sense of betrayal deepened. Nothing added up. Nothing made sense. Then came the day when everything snapped. I had discovered, by accident, a set of messages on Melissa's phone that Rachel hadn't included, proof that the affair hadn't just been casual. It was ongoing, intimate, a secret world where I didn't exist. I remember holding the phone in my hand, staring at the glowing screen as the reality hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt nausea, then heat, then ice. My vision blurred. I wanted to throw the phone, smash it, erase it, but I couldn't. I needed it. I needed proof. Proof that what I feared was true. It was March 21st, a Sunday afternoon, and I remember walking out into the backyard, feeling the wind on my face, the scent of spring in the air, and yet being unable to reconcile the beauty around me with the horror inside. My body was shaking, my chest tight, my mind screaming. I wanted to run, to escape, to leave everything behind and disappear. But I couldn't. The kids were inside. My house was a prison I couldn't leave. And Melissa was in there, oblivious to the fact that the life we had built together was crumbling. I realized then that the breaking point wasn't just the discovery of the affair, it was the total collapse of trust. The realization that the person I had given everything to had chosen deceit over honesty, thrill over family. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a betrayal that cut so deep it left a permanent mark, one that wouldn't heal with time or apologies. I spent hours pacing the backyard that day, the folder and the phone beside me on the table, trying to calm my thoughts, trying to make sense of what had become my reality. By the time the sun started to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, I knew something had to change. I couldn't live in this limbo, half in love, half in rage, pretending everything was okay. I had reached a point where life demanded a choice. Crumble under the weight of betrayal or find a way to reclaim control, whatever that meant. That night, I didn't speak to Melissa. I barely acknowledged her presence. I went to bed alone, the folder clutched like a talisman, a bitter reminder of the truth I couldn't ignore. And as I lay there, staring at the ceiling, I understood something terrifying. Nothing would ever be normal again. My world had been shattered, and I was left to navigate the wreckage, to face the fallout of a secret that had blown up when her lover's wife had shown up at our door. The days after that breaking point felt like wandering through a storm without an umbrella. Everything was chaos, but quiet chaos. The kind that seeps into your bones and makes even the simplest tasks feel impossible. The house was alive with tension, though outwardly it looked normal. Melissa moved around like she always had, talking softly to the kids, cooking, folding laundry, even laughing at things I couldn't muster the energy to notice. But I could see it in every flicker of her eyes, every pause in her speech. She knew I knew. And in that knowledge, a strange war had begun in our home. Jack and Emma were growing more aware by the day. Jack started asking odd questions, innocent but probing, about why Mommy and Daddy seemed upset, why Mommy sometimes left the room suddenly. Emma would sometimes cling to me for longer than usual, her little arms wrapped around my waist, whispering that she didn't like it when Mommy and I were quiet. And I hated it. Every second I saw their confusion, their budding awareness, felt like a knife twisting deeper into me. I wanted to shield them, to fix this invisible fracture, but I didn't know how. Work became unbearable. I couldn't focus. My once organized spreadsheets and timelines were a blur. I found myself staring at the screen, reading the same email over and over, my mind replaying Melissa's texts, Rachel's evidence, her confession. Colleagues started noticing. There were concerned glances, awkward pauses in conversation, and subtle questions like, "Are you doing okay?" I smiled and nodded, but inside I was unraveling. I even considered taking a leave, just to step away from the relentless reminder of normalcy that my office represented. But I knew, deep down, that escaping physically wouldn't solve the emotional hurricane raging in my chest. I began avoiding Melissa, not in the dramatic way people might imagine, but subtly, quiet retreats to the garage, extra hours at work, pretending to be absorbed in phone calls or emails. I didn't want to speak, didn't want to see the casual ease she carried, didn't want to hear her apologies. Each one felt like a stab, a reminder that she had chosen someone else over me repeatedly, over months, even when I had believed in us fully. And then came the community whispers. Suburban life has a way of magnifying the tiniest cracks. A neighbor noticed I was leaving the house later than usual. Someone mentioned seeing Melissa at a cafe alone multiple times. Social media became a minefield. Photos, subtle posts, and hashtags that hinted at a life I wasn't a part of. I knew I was spiraling into paranoia, but every glimpse felt like confirmation that the world was aware of my humiliation. I started keeping a journal, scribbling down every thought, every fear, every recollection of Melissa's deceit. It was compulsive, almost obsessive, but it was the only thing that felt like control. Writing became a catharsis, though not a complete one. The journal became my witness, a silent companion in the nights I couldn't sleep, staring at the ceiling and questioning everything I had ever believed about love, loyalty, and trust. The kids' routines became my anchor. I held on to school drop-offs, homework help, bedtime stories like they were lifelines. I wasn't sure if it was for their sake or my own, but in those moments, I could temporarily forget the betrayal, the lies, and the conversations I had yet to have. I could focus on their laughter, their innocence, the small victories of a block tower standing, or a homework problem solved. It was fleeting relief, but relief nonetheless. Melissa tried to engage me, tried to repair what she had broken. She would leave notes, make small gestures, coffee ready in the morning, my favorite sandwich packed for lunch, but they all felt hollow. It wasn't about the sandwich or the coffee. It was about the fundamental collapse of trust, about knowing that every smile and touch had been undercut by deception. Even when she cried, I couldn't fully absorb it. Part of me was numb. Part of me wanted to lash out. I started noticing things in the environment that reminded me of her betrayal. Tiny triggers that made my stomach twist. The sound of her phone buzzing, the smell of the cafe she frequented, the way she laughed at a joke that wasn't funny. It was relentless. Everything ordinary became colored by suspicion and heartbreak. I even found myself checking her messages, my internal boundaries collapsing under the weight of paranoia and pain. It was a vicious cycle, proof feeding suspicion, suspicion feeding despair, despair feeding obsession. Friends noticed the shift too. Some reached out, offering support. Others stepped back, unsure how to navigate the storm I had entered. I remember one evening, sitting on the porch with my oldest friend Mike, a guy I've known since middle school. He tried to offer advice, but I just stared at him blankly. There were no words, no reassurance that could reach the depth of betrayal I felt. I was untethered, alone in a marriage that had never seemed more like a stranger's arrangement than a home. The legal implications began creeping into my mind too. What would divorce look like? Custody battles? Splitting assets? The thought of having to navigate lawyers, mediation, courtrooms, it felt like yet another layer of chaos on top of a life already crumbling. I realized I had to start thinking practically, even as my emotions threatened to consume me. And then came the first confrontation in front of the kids. Melissa and I were arguing quietly. Well, quietly by adult standards, but still tense and charged in the kitchen. Jack wandered in, curious. Emma followed. The kids didn't understand the complexity of adultery or betrayal, but they sensed tension, and their confusion broke something in me that week. Seeing their wide eyes, hearing their hesitant questions, it was like a mirror reflecting all the damage in a way I couldn't ignore. That night, I realized I was at a crossroads. I could either let the betrayal consume me entirely, destroy my health, my work, my relationship with my kids, or I could begin to think strategically about my next steps. I didn't know what those steps would be yet, whether confrontation, legal action, or some other form of resolution, but I knew that staying in passive despair was no longer an option. Sleep became an enemy. I started taking long walks at night, sometimes just around the block, sometimes through the empty streets of New Haven, the cold wind in my face a small relief from the storm inside. I would replay events, imagine conversations, plan future confrontations in my mind. Every step was measured, deliberate, but nothing could fully escape the shadow Melissa's betrayal had cast. And the truth was, I was changing. I felt it in the way I observed her, in the way I held my kids closer, in the way I processed every interaction. Pain, betrayal, and heartbreak were no longer abstract concepts. They were living, breathing parts of me. They had transformed me into someone I barely recognized, someone more guarded, more calculating, more aware of the fragility of trust. By the end of that month, I had started laying the groundwork for what would come next. I consulted with a lawyer discreetly, organized my thoughts and evidence, and began envisioning a path forward. Not yet revenge, not yet closure, but the beginning of reclaiming control. Because in that mess, that chaos, that storm of betrayal, I realized something vital. If I didn't act, if I didn't take steps to protect myself and my children, no one else would. The fallout wasn't just emotional. It was practical, psychological, and moral. Every day was a battle between what I wanted, justice, perhaps vengeance, and what I needed, clarity, stability, and the preservation of my family. I wasn't sure how the story would end, but I knew one thing. My life had been irrevocably altered, and the days ahead would test me in ways I had never imagined. By April of 2021, I realized I couldn't just exist in the wreckage anymore. The first weeks after discovering Melissa's affair had been a blur of despair, sleepless nights, and quiet, simmering rage. But somewhere in the third week, I felt something shift, a strange, almost terrifying clarity. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I couldn't change the past, couldn't undo her choices, but I could decide how I was going to live moving forward. And more importantly, I could start taking control again. It started small. I organized my life meticulously, like I always had at work, only this time I was applying the same precision to my personal life. I documented everything, every interaction, every suspicious detail, every lie I caught. Melissa's casual, "I'm at work late" texts, the patterns in her schedule, even the tone of her voice when she claimed to be tired or stressed. I wasn't doing this out of paranoia alone. I was doing it to reclaim some sense of power in a situation that had made me feel completely powerless. I also focused on the kids with renewed intensity. Jack's skateboarding, Emma's unicorn, bedtime stories, weekend outings. These weren't just distractions anymore. They were lifelines, reminders of what mattered most. I realized that while Melissa had made choices that shattered trust, my responsibility to my children was still mine, intact. Protecting them became my anchor. I watched Jack master a new trick on his skateboard, celebrated Emma's drawings like they were masterpieces, and reminded myself that their world would remain safe. No matter what chaos lurked between the adults and their lives, the confrontation phase came next. I couldn't ignore Melissa forever, and I knew I had to set boundaries. One evening, I asked her to sit down, not with anger this time, but with calculated resolve. I told her exactly what I knew, laid out the timeline, showed her the evidence Rachel had given me, and explained the implications of her choices. There was no yelling, no sobbing, just cold, clear articulation of facts. She looked at me with a mix of guilt and fear. It was a different power dynamic now. I wasn't the devastated husband anymore. I was the person who had seen the full extent of the betrayal, who had cataloged it, who was deciding how the rest of the story would unfold. Then came the hardest part, the moral conflict. Revenge crossed my mind constantly. The desire to humiliate her, to make her feel a fraction of the pain she'd inflicted, was intoxicating. But I also knew that succumbing entirely to that desire would make me a different person, someone I didn't want to become. I wanted control, yes, but I also wanted to maintain a semblance of dignity for myself and for my kids. So I balanced the scales quietly and directly. I secured legal advice, prepared contingency plans, and made sure that if the marriage ended, I would emerge not just intact, but stable and prepared to continue my life with purpose. Financially, I started taking steps to protect myself. I consulted with a divorce attorney discreetly, reviewed joint accounts, and began separating certain assets. I wasn't scheming for revenge in a vindictive sense. I was planning survival. Melissa's betrayal had stripped me of trust, but it didn't have to strip me of stability. I wanted to ensure that no matter what she chose next, the kids and I would remain secure, emotionally and materially. Meanwhile, I began reconstructing my social world. Friends who had pulled away slowly returned as I became more assertive, more composed. Some offered support, others judgment, but I found that their perceptions didn't matter nearly as much as I had imagined. What mattered was my clarity, my vision, and my ability to navigate the chaos with deliberate steps. I stopped hiding my emotional state from those I trusted, sharing selectively but honestly about the betrayal and its impact. The catharsis in verbalizing my pain, in recounting details I had cataloged meticulously, helped me regain a sense of agency I had thought lost forever. Then, one evening, a breakthrough occurred. Melissa had been evasive, hoping perhaps that silence or tears would be enough to sway me. But I had reached a point where I could interact with her without being overwhelmed by emotion. It was like staring down a storm and realizing that while the sky might still be gray, the lightning could no longer touch you. I was calm, controlled, and deliberate. I wasn't cold. I still felt hurt, betrayal, grief, but I was no longer a victim of it. I also realized the power of public accountability, not in a social media sense, but in a relational sense. Rachel had come to me initially, and in a strange way, that confrontation had catalyzed everything that followed. I started considering the broader implications of secrecy and deception. Melissa had risked not just our marriage, but the emotional safety of our children and the integrity of our family unit. Recognizing this, I began to build boundaries that ensured transparency moving forward. If there were to be any semblance of co-parenting or interaction, It had to be grounded in honesty. One night, I sat down and made a list, not of her wrongs, but of my priorities moving forward. Emotional stability, financial security, protecting the kids, and reclaiming my sense of self. Every small victory, answering emails without distraction, taking Jack to skateboarding practice and being present, finishing a work project without spiraling thoughts, felt monumental. I began to see that control wasn't about punishing Melissa. It was about reclaiming my life, piece by piece. I also began self-reflecting, examining my own role in the marriage, my blind spots, my moments of inattentiveness, not as an excuse, but as a tool for growth. I realized that while her choices were entirely her own, understanding patterns, emotional voids, and unspoken needs could help me navigate relationships in the future with more awareness and resilience. The moral complexity of betrayal doesn't lend itself to simple solutions. And I had to wrestle with the uncomfortable reality that life was messy. People were flawed, and healing required more than anger. It required reflection, strategy, and patience. By May, the first tangible steps of reclamation took form. I organized important documents, set boundaries in our home, and began seeking professional guidance. Not revenge, not confrontation, but emotional and legal clarity. Every step reinforced the understanding that while Melissa's actions had thrown my life into chaos, the next chapter was mine to write. I remember a particular afternoon in early May, walking through East Rock Park with Jack and Emma. The sun was warm, the air carried the scent of blooming flowers. And for the first time in weeks, I felt something like hope. Jack fell and scraped his knee, and I instinctively comforted him, cleaned the wound, and bandaged it carefully. Emma's laughter echoed across the path, her unicorn bouncing as she ran ahead. In that moment, amidst the pain and anger and betrayal, I realized something crucial. The story wasn't over. I had agency. I had the ability to reclaim my life, to protect my children, and to rebuild a future that didn't hinge on Melissa's choices anymore. Turning the tables wasn't about revenge. It was about mastery over my own fate. I had cataloged the betrayal, confronted it, and now I could navigate the aftermath with strategy and emotional clarity. The storm was still there, yes, but I had found shelter within myself. I had found the strength to act deliberately, to prioritize my children, my well-being, and my future. And in that calm determination, I began to see a path forward. A path that didn't erase the betrayal, but allowed me to move through it with control, dignity, and resilience. By the summer of 2021, life had taken on a new rhythm, one that was quieter, more deliberate, and yet undeniably heavier. The initial storm of betrayal had passed, but its residue lingered in every corner of my home, in every thought I had, in every cautious step I took through my relationships. Melissa and I had begun the slow, cold negotiation of what would eventually become our separation. We weren't screaming anymore. We weren't in constant conflict. Instead, there was a tense, brittle civility, like two people carefully maneuvering around landmines, both acutely aware of the damage that had already been done. The children remained my compass. I became hyper-aware of the words I used, the silences I allowed, the small gestures that could convey stability even as our family structure shifted beneath our feet. Jack's skateboarding successes, Emma's tiny artistic victories, even their laughter during dinner. These became my anchors. I realized that while Melissa's betrayal had fractured trust between us, it hadn't broken the essential bonds I had with my kids. That bond I knew would carry me through everything. Financially and legally, I moved with precision. Divorce proceedings were initiated discreetly, assets were separated, and I made arrangements to ensure that Melissa's choices would not jeopardize the children's future. I didn't pursue vengeance, not publicly, not through humiliation. I realized that any attempt at public retribution would only entangle me further in bitterness. Instead, I focused on control, on safeguarding what mattered. Every document signed, every financial decision made, every step through the legal labyrinth felt like reclaiming fragments of myself. Emotionally, I began to heal in unexpected ways. Therapy became a lifeline, not just to process grief, but to rebuild trust in my own judgment and my ability to navigate life without being defined solely by betrayal. I learned to sit with the anger without letting it consume me, to face the hurt without succumbing to despair. Slowly, I began to recognize the strength that had emerged. From the wreckage, the resilience that only comes from staring at your life's destruction. And choosing to move forward deliberately, Melissa eventually moved out in late July, leaving behind a mixture of lingering warmth and the stark emptiness of what had once been our shared life. The house felt hollow at first, every room echoing with memories, every corner a reminder of trust broken. But in that emptiness, I found clarity. I could now envision a future untethered from deceit, guided by my own values and choices. The betrayal had taught me an invaluable lesson. Control and dignity are regained through deliberate, thoughtful action, not reactionary rage. There was a day in early August that remains etched in my memory. I took Jack and Emma to Lighthouse Point Park, the sky a brilliant expanse of blue, the saltwater breeze sharp and clean. The kids ran ahead, carefree, their laughter a balm I hadn't realized I desperately needed. I sat on a bench watching them, and for the first time in months, I felt a measure of peace. The storm had passed, but the landscape it left behind, the scars, the knowledge, the growth remained. And I realized that I was no longer the man defined by betrayal. I was the man who had endured it and emerged stronger, wiser, and more present for what mattered most. I also reached a point of acceptance, perhaps even empathy, though not forgiveness. Melissa's choices had been her own, and the damage she caused was undeniable, but I began to understand human fallibility, the ways people seek fulfillment outside the commitments they make, and the complexities of desire, guilt, and fear. Understanding didn't absolve, but it allowed me to step away without carrying the bitterness that would have destroyed me from within. By September, our separation was formalized. Melissa moved into a small apartment downtown, and while the initial meetings to coordinate the kids' schedules were awkward and tense, they gradually became manageable. I found solace in routine, in the simplicity of stability, in the small, ordinary moments that had always been easy to take for granted. Cooking dinner for the kids, attending school events, helping with homework, even the quiet evenings of reading or watching shows together. All of it became a sanctuary. A reminder that life, though altered, could still be fulfilling. I never expected closure to feel quiet. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final outburst. Closure came in mundane ways, the absence of betrayal in daily interactions, the regained trust between myself and my children, the knowledge that I had survived something that could have destroyed me entirely. It was a slow, steady reclaiming of life, not a fireworks display, but something far more enduring. Reflecting on it now, years later, I understand that this experience reshaped my entire understanding of love, trust, and resilience. Betrayal is a fracture that leaves permanent marks, but those marks can also serve as guides, showing you where strength, awareness, and clarity must reside. I'm not naive. I carry the lessons, the scars, and the vigilance that comes with knowing the depths of deception. But I am also free. Free to rebuild, free to love in a measured, cautious way, free to be the parent my children deserve. Sometimes I still think about that day when Rachel appeared at our door. I think about the shock, the disbelief, the gut-wrenching pain of realizing that the person I loved most had been living a secret life. But I also think about the resilience it forced out of me, the clarity it provided, and the lessons I carry to this day. Life is unpredictable, messy, and often unfair, but it's in how we navigate the storm, how we rebuild from the ruins, that defines who we truly are. As the sun sets over New Haven, I watch Jack practicing his skateboard tricks, Emma twirling with her unicorn, and I realize that the life I feared was shattered has been replaced. Not by the perfect life I once imagined, but by a life I've actively chosen, a life I've fought to reclaim, and a life in which I am still present, still whole and still capable of love, trust, and resilience. The betrayal didn't destroy me. It transformed me, and in that transformation, I found a strength I didn't know I possessed.